Hi there, I'm James Peacock and I'm the founder of the Queen Anne Boleyn Society, which you can find on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.
And I'm Sandra Vasoli. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I'm the author of two novels about Anne Boleyn, Struck with the Dart of Love and Truth Endures, and the author of a narrative nonfiction study of the Tower Letter, which is called Anne Boleyn's Letter from the Tower, A New Assessment. And we're just delighted to be talking with you today, James and I.
We really are, yes, thank you. And today we decided to talk about Queen Elizabeth I and her mother, Queen Anne Boleyn, because many people wonder about how Elizabeth felt about her mother, who was put to death when she was less than 3 years old, wrongfully accused of crimes. And many people believe that Elizabeth never spoke much of Anne and therefore never thought very much of her either at all. But actually, it's easy to gain insight into the great reverence that Elizabeth actually held for her mother, Anne Boleyn. And today we're going to actually be talking to you quite a bit about the clues and stuff that we can gain insight to that. Obviously, we're just going to skim the surface a bit today. But we're going to be leaving more information in the description box and everything for you if you wish to read up more and find out more about it. Also, we'd just like to say a huge thank you to the lovely Natalie for hosting us on this incredible project of hers here. If you haven't already, I do urge you to go and take a look at the other videos and read the articles that have been put out, and also subscribe to Talking Tudors podcast as well, because Natalie does a fantastic job of putting it all together, and we are honoured to be part of it. So, obviously, Elizabeth was born to Anne Boleyn on the 7th of September 1533 at Greenwich Palace on the banks of the River Thames. Now, Greenwich Palace is now the site of the old Royal Naval College, if you ever want to go and visit. And as I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth was less than 3 years old when Anne was put to death on the 19th of May 1536 at the Tower of London. But in that short space of time, Anne was able to bond quite a bit with her daughter, and obviously Elizabeth then carries her memory of her mother, or tries to rehabilitate the memory of her mother through little clues that we're going to give today during her reign in particular. So yes, so during these scant years together, they were actually able to form quite a bond between them. And yeah, so we're going to start discussing that now.
Good. It's interesting that we have evidence that when Queen Anne was in in residence in the court, whether she was at Greenwich or Whitehall, Hampton Court, Richmond, all of the courtiers and all the people who surrounded her were surprised that she very often kept baby Elizabeth near her, sometimes next to her, and often she was lying on a velvet cushion, which was actually very unusual for royal women at that time because their children were kept in the royal nursery with, with their nannies and their, their lady mistresses. But Anne clearly wanted to show off her beautiful baby. We definitely know that she wanted her beautiful little flame-haired princess, because we know that Elizabeth had red hair from birth, to look gorgeously regal at all times. And we definitely have proof that she lavished expensive gifts upon Elizabeth, particularly in terms of the way that she was dressed. So we know that Anne was quite a fashionista in her time. And we also know that she passed that love of clothing down to Elizabeth, who always was gloriously outfitted and used clothing to, to really kind of project her royal image. So we know that throughout her life, Anne really took great care that Elizabeth was outfitted well. And we have, sorry, we'll go back. We have an example here of the King's Record. And if you take a look at the top, you'll see for 1 yard of sarcenet white for the lining of a gown of orange color velvet for my lady princess, which is Elizabeth. So we see references to white sarcenet, russet velvet, black velvet for a partlet, crimson, purple, white, yellow sarcenet. And if you scan down that, you'll be able to see all of these purchases are for my lady princess. It also is recorded that in Henry's ledgers that it states, and quote, boat hire from Greenwich to London and back to take measure of caps for my lady princess, and again to fetch the princess's purple satin cap to mend it. Anne definitely wanted to be sure that her child looked glorious at all times.
Oh, that's brilliant. It seems so strange to us today, but for many generations, all young royal children actually had their own households at a very early age and were separate from the court, often in the countryside, probably away due to like plague and stuff, and all the various stuff that was going around at the time. And Elizabeth had her household established at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire. Today, only the Great Hall survives from the Tudor Palace of Hatfield, but it's a beautiful, beautiful location. So that basically was where she was. She had her household established. And when she was sent to Hatfield, as obviously, as I mentioned, was the custom, Anne made sure that the household was full of her Boleyn relatives. These were her aunts, including Lady Shelton and Anne Clare, who were in charge of the household, and also another lady called Lady Margaret Bryan, who was appointed as Elizabeth's lady mistress. Now, the role of Lady Bryan, the role that Lady Bryan played in Elizabeth's life was huge and very significant. And Anne's respect for Lady Bryan was such that courtiers regularly sought her advice. So Anne made sure also that her little girl had, as a governess, someone who would care for her and guard her, which Lady Bryan did for many years. And they would, seek out Lady Bryan when wanting to get what to get Anne for gifts or something like that. So they had quite a good relationship. And now this concern that Lady Bryan maintained for Elizabeth lasted well beyond Anne's death, as mentioned in May 1536. And there is existing a letter which still exists, which we'll show you soon. And this is which she implores the king and the Lord Chamberlain for funds to provide for Elizabeth's wardrobe, which she had outgrown. Now, in the months after Anne's execution, obviously Henry remarries Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour was promoted by the imperial faction at the English court. But of course, Anne Boleyn, pretty much most of her supporters were wiped out with her death in May 1536. Now, Henry's other daughter, Mary, was still considered illegitimate at this time. But Mary also had quite a powerful connection, being half Spanish, and also Jane Seymour, as mentioned, the imperial faction was, of course, supporting Mary. Elizabeth, no one was really going to stick their neck out for Elizabeth, and she was all but forgotten. So she outgrows her clothes very quickly. Obviously, being a toddler, she's growing fast, but she's basically being ignored. So Lady Bryan's having to write to the court and basically tell them that Elizabeth is outgrowing, that she needs more clothes and stuff because she's obviously growing quickly. And she took it as her responsibility to be sure that little Elizabeth was clothed and fed. And at that point, her father, the king, obviously paid Elizabeth very little to no attention at all. She doesn't really come back to court until October 1537 for her brother Edward's christening at Hampton Court. And then, of course, Jane Seymour's death just shortly after. But yeah.
So sad.
I know.
Yeah, it's interesting that we have that this letter exists. It is in the British Library, and by its burned, remnants, you can see that it was part of the cotton collection, which got caught in that terrible fire, in 31 or 32. But it is, you can see at the top, it says, "My Lord," it's a letter from Lady Margaret Bryan to the Lord Chamberlain. So asking him to speak on Elizabeth's behalf for funds for her, the goods that she needed to live. So, so it's great to be able to have this and take a look, because we know, how neglected she was at that stage, which which is really sad. But we do, we know that as she grew, Elizabeth maintained a really close relationship with her Carey Boleyn cousins, both Catherine and Henry. And here we see pictures of both of them. They were both considered the children, or when I say both, we'll speak about that for a second. They were considered the children of Elizabeth's aunt and sister, Mary Boleyn, and her first husband, William Carey. Of course, we know that Henry did have a relationship with Mary Boleyn at some point before he began his relationship with Anne, her sister Anne. And some people do believe that they are, in fact, the children of Mary and Henry VIII. So that's probably going to be eternally debated. However, Elizabeth kept them very close. They would have been her half siblings, in fact, if they were the children of Henry VIII and Mary, but we don't know. And we also don't know whether Elizabeth thought that they were her siblings or not. But she did keep them close to her, and she gave them both high positions in her court. Henry served on her privy council. Catherine served in her bedchamber. And Elizabeth referred to him in her letters as our cousin, your loving cousin, or your loving kinswoman. And she bestowed honors upon them, Elizabeth did. Henry was created first Baron Hunsdon. As you see, Lord Hunsdon up in the portrait of him. Catherine was created a lady of the Privy Chamber. So we know that they were relatives of hers that she kept close through her Boleyn lineage. And now let's talk for a little bit with James about some of the items that exist today that indicate Elizabeth's respect for her mother, Anne. And actually, there are quite a few. So we're going to talk about a few of them today. So, James.
Thank you, Sandy. And yes, there are actually quite a few, and they are all quite fascinating. And a few of them are actually held in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So mostly if anyone's over up in London, do go and have a visit. So we know that Elizabeth owned a set of Virginials. Now, these were like an early keyboard musical instrument. And one of the remaining ones, as you can see pictured here, is incredibly beautiful, and it's inlaid with designs and emblems, and a prominent emblem that features in it is the falcon badge, which obviously was adopted by Anne when she was about to be crowned queen. And here that Elizabeth used Anne's emblem and displayed it prominently throughout her reign as well. So not just here, but it's also in other places as well. It's full of symbolism and very positive representation of her queenship. And it seems that Elizabeth obviously must have embraced the badge and had it incorporated in a number of things that she owned. And another of these, in addition to the Virginials, as you see sort of on the screen here to the right, is a set of table linen that was owned by Elizabeth, a tablecloth and a cloth napkin. And they are woven in linen damask, and clearly stitched into the pattern is the repeating image, of the falcon badge. So it's interesting to think of Elizabeth actually dining on the cloth, and was such a distinct reminder of her mother. No doubt she dined on that when ambassadors and diplomats and ministers were all coming in there to dine with her. So that's quite fascinating to think of.
I agree. I like to think that she probably did not use, well, she might have used items like this privately, but I think that it's very interesting that she might have had affairs of state and had tablecloths in her linen. And you notice that it's not at the bottom, it's right there at the top. It's really prominent, and stitched under that you can see Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth. So that's a beauty. It's amazing that it still exists, but
it really is, and we're so lucky to, any artifacts or anything that still exists is incredible, but particularly this one here, because God knows if we'd have any reference to it otherwise.
Right, right. And it's quite easy to interpret then when you see something like this and you see this beautiful musical instrument, which this is part of the board above the keyboard with that, you know, the falcon badge as prominent as can be in it, that, you know, she made quite a statement. So,
Yeah,
you know,
incredible.
and I think that she did this throughout her life. So we also have the amazing and stunning pocket ring, which many people know of, but it's called the Chequers ring because it's kept at Chequers, which is the country estate of the Prime Minister. And even though it looks big here, I can assure you, I have seen it. I think James has seen it also. It's very, very small. The ring is really tiny. It was probably made for her pinky finger. It's made of gold, rubies, diamonds, and mother of pearl. And on the cover is, you know, there's an E, fashion of diamonds for Elizabeth, with an enamel R entwined, which stands for Elizabeth Regina. And then once opened, there are two tiny portraits within. And truly, I mean, I remember seeing it and thinking each of those portraits is literally like the size of your baby fingernail. They're really tiny, but they're very detailed. So this is a pretty good shot because you can really see. First of all, you can see that it's 3D, so it wasn't a flat painting, but they're made of enamel and they're raised. They're like kind of, you know, 3D, and the likenesses are really striking. So the side which opens down bears a miniature of Elizabeth in her latter years, which is quite obvious. And the portrait, which is embedded in the ring's body, closest to her finger, is of a woman who strongly resembles the portraits we know of Anne, her mother. And I would say that most historians feel that it is Anne, her mother. It's very similar to the Most Happy Medal and the Hever portrait and other portraits that we know of her, the face shape and the French hood and, you know, and everything. So, I mean, I know James and I both feel that it is Anne.
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, and what's interesting is that, so yeah, there is some debate. Some people will say that it is of Catherine Parr, who Elizabeth was close to, but you know, we'd leave it up to you to decide what you think.
Yeah.
We know that Elizabeth wore it, so, and you can see that it's been worn. Underneath the ring is an emblem of a phoenix. So unfortunately, you can't see that too well, I'm sorry to say, but you will see that there's like a little insignia in the inside of the ring, and that is inlaid. It's of gold, and it's inlaid, and it's of a phoenix. And so it has been said that that it's believed that that's an indication that the ring was presented by Edward Seymour to Elizabeth as a gift, since the Seymours used a phoenix as one of their family symbols. However, there are a number of other sightings of Elizabeth wearing a phoenix, some in conjunction with the white falcon, which is very telling. So for me, I think that it was Elizabeth's representation of her mother rising as would a phoenix through her daughter's queenship.
Yeah.
It seems meaningful to me.
Really.
I actually think that Elizabeth had this ring made for herself. I don't know. I just think that it's so intimate and it's so meaningful. I have a hard time picturing somebody else venturing into that very intimate space and having it made for her. But,
Definitely.
you know, I don't know. I mean, and then there's the tale that the ring was pried from her finger upon her death, but that we don't know that that's the case. Nonetheless, we know she wore it, and it's a really powerful symbol about how she felt about the mother that she knew for such a short time.
Yeah, I agree. I certainly don't quite see Edward Seymour gifting it to her myself. Yeah, I don't, but I agree very much with what you just said, Sandra. Yeah.
It's a great artifact, and it'll always, those things will always be a mystery. But it's, again, it's amazing that we have this item.
Oh, it's just
tells us.
and when you think how small, like as you said, those images so small, so the detail that goes into them is just incredible, really. Just to think someone would sat there for hours and hours, probably days, weeks as well, painstakingly getting those images so perfect, and yet they're so small, yet they've got the features. It is just remarkable. It's absolutely. So obviously there are other representations by Elizabeth to show her refusal to allow her mother's memory to be stamped out. And one of my favourite ones is of the day of Elizabeth's coronation procession, which takes place the day before her coronation on the streets of London. Now, traditionally, this was a time when they go around and there'd be lavish pageants and everything performed at different stops for them and everything, which Elizabeth would always, but whoever it was would always act surprised at seeing them, but they knew full well what was coming, basically. And the first pageant is the most telling here because it is, it's at Grace Church Street. And it's basically, so you've got here the image of the coronation procession itself that was done around the time. And this pageant is called the Pageant of the Roses. And so it's basically to show Elizabeth's genealogy, as it were, her line of descent. And so if we picture it, there's a 3-tier platform here that's been erected. And on each tier is the people representing the Tudor dynasty, supported by unity and concord as well. Now, on the lowest tier were Elizabeth's paternal grandparents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Obviously, their marriage, combined the warring houses of Lancaster and York, so bringing peace to the realm, as it were. And on the next level were Elizabeth's parents, Henry VIII, and next to him was Anne Boleyn. And this was the first public reference here to Anne in over 20 years. And not only was it the first public reference, it's also the first positive reference as well in a long time. And then above that, on the highest tier, is Elizabeth herself. And this is basically Elizabeth showing her line of descent here. So naturally it goes from Henry VII to her parents. And then obviously she then, being their daughter, is now Queen of England. So she believes in her own legitimacy, basically, is what she's saying here. She is the natural heir and successor. So with explaining that, it's of course no surprise at all that Elizabeth did not shrink from pronouncing both her parents king and queen in the same way and on the same level of honour at all. And there's a really interesting report here from the Venetian ambassador to England, Giovanni Michiel, and he recorded this during Mary I's reign. And it describes Elizabeth's attitude. Now, Mary had just passed a law not long after she came to the throne, which basically repealed the Act of Succession, the first Act of Succession that Henry VIII did in 1534, that stated that Mary was illegitimate. So she basically was, by repealing this act, she was declaring that she, in law, was the legitimate heir and successor, and her parents, Henry and Catherine of Aragon, marriage had never been annulled. So basically, Elizabeth, this was saying, was illegitimate. So in all this, basically, there's a bit of hostility that comes out between Mary and Elizabeth. Now, Mary did suffer pretty harshly in those years, but obviously the people that she blamed for all that were now long gone. But the product of all that, Elizabeth, was still there. So naturally, it meant the relation between the two sisters definitely took a complete nosedive, shall we say. It soured. And Elizabeth bore the brunt of some of this frustration, this hurt. But Elizabeth showed no sign at all that she believed herself any less legitimate. And Giovanni Michiel actually writes a really interesting report here, which I'm going to read out to you now. And speaking about Elizabeth, he says, although she knows she was born of such a mother, she nevertheless does not consider herself of inferior degree to the Queen, who she equals in self-esteem. Neither does she believe herself less legitimate than Her Majesty, alleging in her own favour that her mother would never cohabit with the king unless by way of marriage with the authority of the church. So therefore we know that Elizabeth always considered that her mother Anne Boleyn's marriage to King Henry was legitimate, real and true, basically.
Yeah, that's quite a statement, and she certainly she asserted it loud and clear.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So there's another artifact which is heartbreaking, I think, and I believe, as based upon the research that I've done, I believe that it was held by Elizabeth. If she did own it in her lifetime, it's hard to imagine what it must have meant to her. It's the letter which I believe was composed and dictated by Anne while she was locked in the tower awaiting her death. And this is an image of it. It's dated May 6th. So many of you may know about it. May 6th, 1533. It was intended for her husband, the king, and I emphasize her husband because that's how it is composed. It is not a letter that is, from the queen to the king. This is from a wife to a husband, and it's very poignant in that regard. To me, it's very typical expression of whom we have come to know Anne to be. It's a pronouncement to her husband that she loved him, that she was faithful to him, that she loved him still. And it goes on to beg not for her own life, because I think she knew at this point that even though maybe there had been hope that something might have, rectified the situation, she knew that things were coming to an end, but she begged for the lives of the men wrongfully accused with her. And she definitely expresses in this her deep concern for Henry's soul. So my research indicates that this letter, and many of you have heard this as well, was never seen by the king, but instead it was found hidden in Thomas Cromwell's belongings after his own beheading in 1540. And I think through the convoluted and mysterious path that this document that we're looking at took, I think that this actual document was recovered and given to William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, Elizabeth's great advisor and protector. And I think that both Burleigh and Elizabeth kept it safe. We know that there were early copies made of it, and I believe that they had several copies made for posterity, and eventually it was passed on to an antiquarian to care for and save, and that's how it's reached the British Library today. So, but if Elizabeth did own it, and again, I do believe that she did, what a testament to her mother's innocence she must have found by reading this letter.
Yeah, absolutely. And a special shout out also to Sandy's wonderful book, mentioned earlier, Anne Boleyn's Letter from the Tower, New Assessment. Although I'm sure Sandy will say herself, the research is still ongoing.
It is.
Yeah, so Sandy obviously is always open to chatting about this incredible piece of work. Excuse me. Now, obviously, as I said earlier, there is so much more evidence we could explore. But today, we're going to leave you with a very interesting discovery that Sandy and I made about 5 years ago now, when we were at the British Archives in the British Library doing some researching and everything. And we had the privilege of viewing an incredibly just stunning book called The Genealogical Tree Showing Descent of Queen Elizabeth I. Now, this was given to Elizabeth, we believe, in the early years of her reign, and each page details Elizabeth's genealogical tree, descended from Rollo, Duke of Normandy, a Viking who ruled Normandy in about 860 AD. There are some images on the British Library website, but the reason why we haven't used them here is because they really don't do justice, I'm sure Sandy would agree, to the book itself, but do take our word for it. They were just incredibly beautiful, and each page kind of had like a tree branches coming out from the side onwards. So just imagine from the left-hand side of the screen, you had these tree branches kind of beautifully decorated with little images. So you have all the kings and queens that you can think of, basically. And obviously, as we mentioned, Rollo, Duke of Normandy, goes right up to Elizabeth I. So it's possible to trace Elizabeth's ancestors through the many centuries from the 9th century right up to her. Now, when we got to the page about Elizabeth, we were a little bit disappointed, really, because there were no images of Henry and Elizabeth, which was quite disappointing. But actually, what we found instead kind of made up, well, actually did make up for that. I'm sure Sam would agree. And it was incredibly curious as well, because what they had written about, particularly about Anne and Elizabeth, but we'll read out what they said about all three of them. So for Henry, it describes him as the most excellent and victorious Prince Henry VIII was crowned King of England and France and Lord of Ireland in the year of our Lord 1509. Then for Anne, it says, the most gracious Princess, Lady Anne, Marquess of Pembroke, the first wife of King Henry VIII, was crowned Queen of England and France in AD 1533. But then for Elizabeth, it says, the right virtuous and most noble and godly Princess Elizabeth, the sole daughter and heir to the high and mighty Prince Henry VIII, was crowned Queen of England, France and Ireland in the year of our Lord God, 1558. So those definitely made up for any disappointment we had of not seeing images of Anne, Henry and Elizabeth there. But that in itself just goes to show, as what we've explained earlier, particularly the coronation procession, etc., and the report from Giovanni Michiel, that Elizabeth had no doubt was at all in her legitimacy and her parent and how valid her parents' marriage was. She believed that. It's often focused that, you know, people tend to ask, well, why did Elizabeth not repeal her mother's execution and the crimes that she was accused of and bring in a law like Mary did to state her own legitimacy? And yes, it would have been wonderful if she did, but we have to remember that although we do believe, obviously Sandy and I, and many people believe that Anne was innocent, she was put to death by orders of King Henry VIII. Now, to repeal that, Elizabeth would have been basically saying either her father was completely wrong or he'd been misled by people around him, which would be kind of taking away from the most victorious part and everything. So unfortunately, it would have been opening a huge can of worms. And as we said here, Elizabeth believed in her own legitimacy. So as far as she was concerned, she wanted to focus on the present and the future. She obviously had a lot to contend with at the start of her reign, establishing her rule, her reign, and particularly around, you know, with the courts of Europe, Spain and France, two very dominant Catholic countries, were very powerful at that point. So she had a lot of other things to contend with. And in her own way, as we mentioned, she believed in her legitimacy, and that was kind of it for her, really. But yeah, so so that's kind of hopefully answers some of that, really.
It was, I mean, I remember when we were, and by the way, that book, it's a huge book. And I can remember us sitting there going through the pages, you know, hoping that we were going to see a portrait of Anne, which we did not. But when we were reading the Gothic script that accompanied the page about Elizabeth, and we got to the part where it said, the most gracious Princess Lady Anne, Marquess of Pembroke, the first wife to King Henry VIII, we both looked at each other like, oh my gosh.
I know.
Wife. So it was quite an assertion that, you know, the first marriage was an illegitimate marriage.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was cool looking at that book that day. And you know, so really, as you can see, James and I, and as he just described, we're both convinced that even though she did not take legal action to, you know, to repeal laws and acts about her mother, she really did evidence with great frequency ways to keep her mother's name, image, and legacy alive. And today, I mean, we can say with great assurance that she was quite successful. And
Yeah,
you know, James and I wanted to have us all take a look at a couple of pictures, a couple of portraits side by side of mother and daughter, and you know, there's no, it's the resemblance and just the whole presence that they carried is so evident.
absolutely. And I think, you know, Elizabeth, she very much has the colouring and the obviously the hair as well. Her colour of her hair and her paleness of her skin is very much her father. But in many other ways, you could say she very much resembles Anne, particularly the eyes and the face and everything as well.
I always
Uh,
like looking at they had very distinct noses. I mean,
mm,
Henry did as well, but you know, we're looking at a Holbein sketch, which has been debated as to whether it's Anne or not. But a lot of people do believe that this one and the accompanying one with her just in the coif are in
mm,
fact Anne. And
mm,
this other beautiful portrait of Elizabeth, and they look like they were pretty much at the same age in
mm.
these two, you know, works of art. And I mean, to me, they're so reminiscent of each other.
Yeah, yeah, and it has often been said that a lot of portraits of Anne that come, obviously, as we know, come after her execution, were based feature-wise on Elizabeth because they did resemble each other quite a bit in their features as well. How true that is, though, obviously, you
Right.
know, yet to find a direct reference of that, but it's interesting to sort of speculate that.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. So,
Mm,
so anyway, that's a little bit about Elizabeth, you know, really being her mother's daughter and revering her in so many ways and inheriting her wit, her character, her strength, her intelligence, as well as that of her father, you know, which really resulted in her being a ruler unlike any other that
yeah,
England has known. Um,
definitely.
so we're very appreciative of you joining us.
Yes, a huge thank you. I should also add an interesting little fact here, but when we were talking about Catherine Carey and Henry earlier, now the royal family today are actually descended from Mary Boleyn. The Queen, current Queen, is descended from Catherine Carey, and Princess Diana was descended from Henry Carey. Now, it is mostly believed that if any either of the children would have been Henry VIII, the evidence really does look quite strong for Catherine in particular, which is so interesting because that could mean that the Queen today is a direct, and obviously that means Charles, William, Harry, etc., George. That means they are also descended from Henry VIII. So I do like to think that yes, they were, you know, at least Catherine was the daughter of Henry VIII, because then that would make the Queen today a direct descendant of Henry VIII, as well as obviously being related to the Boleyns.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. So, well, thank you again for joining us. And don't forget, post questions or comments. We'll be happy to reply. And
Yes,
also, if you are not already a patron of the Talking Tutors podcast, it would be a great thing to do. And you know, there's no end to fascinating information and access to people who are just so knowledgeable that it's always enjoyable.
yeah, it's incredible, incredible series, just absolutely incredible. And once again, a huge thank you to Natalie
Thank you,
for
Natalie.
doing all this, for everything she does, for having us on board.
Yeah.
It's incredible. Do go and check out the other videos and articles again in this series because there've been so many on different, you know, Tudor queens, and they're all brilliant. So yeah, huge thank you.
It's huge. Thank you. And we're the last one. So we're going to blow a kiss and say thank you
Yes,
and
thank
goodbye.
you very much. Bye
Bye.
bye.